Alaska Insight is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers just like you. Thank you.
Hundreds of Ukrainians fleeing war have found work and community stability in Alaska. But a federal pause on programs that aid immigration and resettlement now threaten their ability to stay.
Мы не знаем, что будет дальше, но на сегодняшний день Бог благословляет, все устрояется. И благодарим Бога за сегодняшний день, а завтрашний день Боже благослови. И все.
What do these new residents and other refugees and immigrants here need to know about the federal changes and their rights? We'll discuss it right now on Alaska Insight. Immigrants have helped build our nation's infrastructure. Alaska is home to immigrants and refugees from across the world. Our state benefits from a wide range of different skills to meet Alaska's labor needs, and communities are enriched by a mix of cultures. But programs that bring refugees and immigrants to our state are under threat. Tonight we'll learn about who is at risk and what they can do to protect themselves. Before we get to that discussion, here are some of the top stories of the week from Alaska Public Media's collaborative statewide news network. Governor Mike Dunleavy ordered a freeze last week on most state hiring, out-of-state travel, and new regulations as oil prices tumble. Oil production in Alaska is expected to increase in the coming years as new projects come online, but at the same time, the price of a barrel of North Slope crude fell more than $10 in April, and prices are expected to fall further in the coming months. Dunleavy's office declined an interview request on Monday, but in a statement said falling prices meant the state had no choice but to institute the freezes. Some agencies, especially those dealing with public safety, are exempt from the freeze. Lawmakers had mixed responses. Some agreed with the governor's assessment of state finances, while others raised concerns about how this could affect state services. And a third Republican entered the race to be Alaska's next governor. Conservative activist Bernadette Wilson declared her candidacy on the steps of the Alaska State Capitol in Juneau on Tuesday. Wilson is a business owner who has also led conservative policy groups and been active in conservative politics in Alaska. She pitched herself as a political outsider in an interview. She's a sponsor of the latest ballot initiative seeking to repeal Alaska's open primaries and ranked choice voting. Until recently, she was the interim executive director of the Alaska Policy Forum, a conservative think tank. When asked about her priorities, Wilson brought up the state's failure to pay permanent fund dividends in line with a formula in state law that lawmakers have essentially ignored since the mid-2010s. She also said she would reduce the state workforce in order to address the state's looming budget crunch. Fairbanks Republican Click Bishop and Republican Lieutenant Governor Nancy Dahlstrom also filed letters of intent to run for governor this month. Anchorage Mayor Suzanne LaFrance says her administration is working to ramp up the clearing of major homeless camps. At a press conference on Wednesday, LaFrance said her team would start to abate 2 large campsites in the coming weeks, one at Davis Park in Mountain View and the other in a nearby snow dump site. LaFrance said 23 homeless camps have been cleared since January. The Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness estimates that of the more than 3,000 people experiencing homelessness in Anchorage, a little more than 500 are currently without shelter, and LaFrance's administration is taking a few approaches to bringing that number down alongside abatements. Farina Brown, a special assistant to the mayor who focuses on homelessness issues, says city officials are working to connect residents from the cleared camps to resources. The city also has year-round shelter now for the first time since 2023. You can find the full version of these and many more stories on our website, alaskapublic.org, or download the Alaska Public Media app on your phone. Now on to our discussion for this evening, immigrants in Alaska. More than 700 Ukrainians have settled in Alaska since Russia invaded their country 3 years ago. More than 100 of them are in Delta Junction, but it's unclear if they have a future in the community. several programs supporting their stay in the U.S. have been suspended. Ukrainians in Delta Junction are leaning on their faith to get through the uncertain times. Alaska desk Alona Naden spent a day with one Ukrainian family who is making this place home.
The Butenko family has adjusted to life in rural Alaska quickly. Natalia and Alexei moved to Delta Junction with their 7 children from Ukraine 3 years ago. They chose this place to join relatives.
Да, мужа брат, родной, здесь уже 16 лет назад сюда прилетел. Он здесь женился на моей двоюродной сестре. И так и получилось, что мы именно сюда летели. Как бы к ним и в эту церковь, они в эту церковь ходили.
Roughly 120 Ukrainians have settled in the Delta Junction area in recent years, a significant number for a place with about 1,000 residents. Many of them, including the Butenko family, used the United for Ukraine program. It allowed them to come to the US with the help from a local sponsor. The program stopped accepting new applicants in January, following an order from President Trump.
А здесь, конечно, у нас свобода. Дети могут иметь велосипеды, квадроциклы, кататься, без проблем, просто без проблем. Мячи, то, нам очень здесь нравится и нормально, уютно.
Even before Russia invaded Ukraine, Delta Junction already had strong Slavic roots. People from former Soviet Union countries have been settling here since the early 90s. Ukrainians specifically make up a much larger share of the Delta Junction area than the rest of the state. The Slavic influence is reflected in local stores and in places of worship. Denis Hatman, a local contractor and an immigrant himself, has found employees through the church community.
I think everybody who comes here, they looking forward for that better life. And this is what America provides. Hey, you want to work, you will get it. So that's where we are here. We want to raise up America and have a better life.
The Delta Greeley School District has opened its doors to about 30 Ukrainian students who immigrated since the war started. The district has been expanding support for them, offering English as a second language classes, translation services, and after-hours tutoring. Longtime English teacher Amanda Turnbull has been working with Ukrainian students and witnessing their rapid growth.
I feel absolutely blessed, absolutely honored to be these kids' teacher.
Turnbull says if the families of her Ukrainian students don't have a legal pathway to stay in the country, her whole ESL class of 10 would be empty. She says the loss would create a hole in the community and could endanger some of her students.
Yeah, it hurts my heart so much to think of these high school boys who could, at the drop of a hat, get deported and end up back in Ukraine. They can't leave again. These 9th graders can't leave again. What's going to happen to them? They're going to get conscripted?
Natalia Butenko doesn't want to go back to Ukraine or see her children go to war. She'd like to keep putting down roots in her new community.
Мы не знаем, что будет дальше, но на сегодняшний день Бог благословляет, все устрояется, и благодарим Бога за сегодняшний день, а завтрашний день Боже благослови, и все.
The family recently bought a piece of land to build their future home in Delta. 2 stories, just like the one they left in Ukraine. In Delta Junction, with reporting help from Shelby Herbert, I am Alona Naden.
Joining me tonight to describe the current situation for refugees and immigrants in Alaska is Issa Spatrosano. Issa is the Refugee Program Coordinator for Catholic Social Services, and Cindy Woods is the Senior Immigration and Policy Fellow for the ACLU of Alaska. Welcome. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Issa, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program was shut down on January 20th. Describe how people come here under that program and how the closure of it is affecting them now.
Yeah, traditionally the refugee program's over 40 years old. It was established in the 1980 Refugee Act, which I like to always say passed unanimously in the US Senate. So I think we're in different times now, but I just want to always say it wasn't always like this. The refugee program has had long bipartisan support for the many outcomes it brings us as a nation. It's important to our national security, it's important to our global outreach, and it's important to who we are as Americans and this belief that we're a nation of immigrants, and serving those in humanitarian crisis is something we've been called to do for a long time in this country. And so the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program effectively was the process in which people could arrive to the United States through the refugee program. And so it was a partnership with the State Department and other local nonprofits in our communities who would bring people here. And Alaska's been doing that for over 20 years. And so the administration effectively closed it on January 20th with an executive order and has since then cut all the national contracts and terminated them as a result of many of the changes made in the State Department. So today, even if somebody was ready to travel and cleared to travel as a refugee, there wouldn't be any legal process really for them to arrive. There wouldn't, I shouldn't say legal process, there's no system in which they could arrive through because that system's really been put on pause or contracts terminated that it largely operated under.
There's been a lot of legal challenges. Is there a legal challenge to that executive order at this time?
There certainly have been legal challenges, especially around the individuals who were the 12,000 people who already had booked flights, who were already ready to depart. And so there have been a number of legal challenges. Cindy's probably the best to speak through what that might look like. But yeah, there's been a number of legal challenges and challenges to this idea of just being able to shut the program down. And so that's been going through litigation really since it occurred.
Mm-hmm. Cindy, is that refugee program, is that the way that most people have come to Alaska from other places?
So that's one option for people who are coming to the United States. And as I mentioned, the refugee program is a program that screens and vets individuals who have fled their home countries for refugee status, and once that status is established, then they're resettled in countries including the United States. But there's a lot of other ways that people can come to the United States. There's a number of parole programs that were instituted over the course of the last administration that were specifically geared towards people of certain nationalities, like folks from Ukraine, Afghanistan, and then Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Folks can come in with tourist visas, work visas. They can be petitioned by their relatives who live here in the United States. And then also individuals can come to the border and seek to prevail themselves of international asylum law and request asylum here in the United States. So those would also be folks who have fled their home countries as well out of fear of persecution or torture. But instead of being vetted outside of the country through the refugee program, they're availing themselves of the U.S. territory and asking the United States to adjudicate a potential asylum claim for them.
The U.S. Supreme Court is hearing a case this week about birthright citizenship. President Trump wants to end it for some people, but the current case centers on the Trump administration's challenge to the ability of lower courts to issue nationwide universal injunctions. Cindy, what should Alaskans know about this and the current lower court challenges to the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship?
Yeah, so it's big news that this has gone up to the Supreme Court. And it's very concerning. There have been 3 cases, I believe, that have challenged the executive order that would change birthright citizenship. And the lower courts in all of those cases have found it to be unconstitutional. And so what the Supreme Court is actually reviewing is whether or not those lower courts have the ability to issue what's called a nationwide injunction, which would force the government to stop its new birthright citizenship policy nationwide. Instead, folks are saying that maybe there should be a class action, so only individuals who are part of a class. There is a lot of the use of nationwide injunctions in previous administrations as well. The argument here is that, if in 10 states there is birthright citizenship and the other 40 there aren't, it's going to create mass confusion here. And I think specifically one of the Supreme Court justices said today, you lost in every lower court, why are you here? But basically, in terms of the actual idea of eliminating birthright citizenship, that is something that has been inscribed in our Constitution and in the 14th Amendment and has been challenged at previous times in the past and always been upheld. It's seemingly very clearly stated in the letter of the Constitution that folks who are born in the United States are U.S. citizens. So it'll be interesting to see what comes up, and it's not surprising that the arguments before the Supreme Court now are more procedural and not specifically challenging the legality of the policy, because I think it's pretty clearly unconstitutional.
I can't imagine how much anxiety people who are recently in the state or maybe have been here for quite some time, and all this confusion over what current status is. What are you hearing from the folks that you work with about even people that are here legally and have, solid paperwork to support that? What is the level of fear and anxiety for everyone right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see it in the clip that played in Delta Junction. I mean, people are kind of living day by day to try to figure out, like, what kind of grounds do I have to stay, to go. People are trying to figure out how to keep their kids safe. I mean, people come to the United States, if you're refugees, for safety, and for others for opportunity. And really most of that opportunity is driven by, like keeping your children safe or keeping your family safe. And so you start to look around, and I think people are saying, am I safe here? And that's what I'm hearing. Am I safe here? Am I still safe here? Is this really the best place to keep my family and in this circumstance? And so that fear is becoming very real for people. And even people who have status, I know how important it is to the people I resettle to become U.S. citizens. It's something they really, really think about on day one when they get here. In 5 years, I can become a U.S. citizen for refugees. And, I had a client come in who's a refugee. She became a U.S. citizen 3 years ago, and she just came to see me to ask if she was going to get her citizenship revoked. There's that fear of, even when you feel like you have status and some permanency, that it doesn't feel that way right now. And she had gotten a letter from USCIS asking something about her case, and it just spiked this fear immediately. Am I getting, deported? And she's been a U.S. citizen for 3 years. And so that fear is very much on the surface for everyone right now, I think.
Cindy, what are you hearing?
A lot of the same, a lot of uncertainty for folks who have statuses here that in the past have been very secure, even legal permanent residents, people who are on the path to citizenship. There's just so much happening in terms of new policies, new executive orders that don't, carry the weight of law at the moment they're issued, but are very concerning. There's a lot happening in terms of litigation, and so it's really hard, even for an immigration attorney, to stay on top of the current state of the law, because it's changing every day. And so what we're seeing is a lot of folks who need to have those consultations with immigration attorneys and understand what are the risks, what are the possibilities. But also the message that we should be sharing is that non-citizens have constitutional rights. They have rights here in this country. And it's important for them to understand that and to assert that. And so educating the population on that has been really critical as well. And just also, not panicking, not having fear, and, waiting to see what these policies actually shake out to be. Because as we've seen with the revocation of the student visas for students, the administration walked that back after a series of cases were filed against them in that. And so it's an ever-changing landscape, what's happening.
Before the last presidential election, there was a bipartisan effort in Congress to address immigration and border security. Sometimes it's known as the Lankford Bill, after Republican Senator James Lankford, who brought it forward. Then candidate Trump didn't want it passed, and it ultimately failed. We've seen a flurry of executive orders, but have either of you seen any attempts at legislation from lawmakers or some sort of a response to what's happening currently? Any new legislative efforts coming forward?
I mean, I think there's been some legislative efforts, but nothing comprehensive. I think recently Senator Murkowski co-sponsored a bill that would have given Ukrainians some additional protections. It's not totally an answer to a pathway to stay, but it would have been some additional cover in case their status is revoked. But are those things gaining traction? Are they moving forward? We haven't really seen that. I mean, there's been a bill introduced every year in Congress since the first Trump administration called the GRACE Act that would set a minimum standard for the refugee program that has to be followed, but it hasn't gotten the traction to get, move forward. So I think We haven't seen comprehensive. I think we've seen some try to fixes. Same with Afghans. There was a bill that was introduced when all the Afghans came that would have given them an adjustment of status to stay here as lawful permanent residents. It never passed. And so I think that even if things are being introduced, we're not seeing them move forward. And so the consequences of lacking strong intervention coming from the legislative branch is really resulting in what is a very chaotic system of answers instead of really comprehensive fixes to some of the problems that we know persist because there's not good updated legislation.
Cindy, is there anything that you're tracking or trying to promote as far as legislative initiatives that you'd like to see come forward?
Yeah, so one thing that we're following is the current appropriations process and the reconciliation that's happening right now in terms of setting the budget and just the massive amount of money that the administration is asking for in order to carry out its mass deportation plans. We're talking about tripling the amount of detention space, the funds for hiring deportation officers, and so that's one thing we're tracking. A lot of the executive orders and things that this administration want to carry out are not possible unless they have the funding to do that. Unfortunately, we're on the defensive on a lot of things. I think another thing we're tracking is the SAVE Act that is attempting to change the requirements needed in order to vote, kind of relying on this rhetoric again that there are non-citizens who are voting and we need to protect that, when in reality it would just make for a lot of Alaskans specifically who live rurally, who are Native Alaskans, it would make it much more difficult for them to vote as well. And so we're actually having a town hall on that, the ACLU and the League of Women Voters next week. But that's another one that we're really tracking as well. So unfortunately, there's not many positive pieces of legislation being introduced at this time, but the same way that we're tracking policies and seeking to litigate, we're also tracking legislation and making sure that the public is informed and can participate, because that's really what part of the American process is speaking with our representatives and letting them know how these bills will impact us, and us being all Alaskans, not just U.S. born, but the incredible number of foreign-born Alaskans that contribute to our economy and our culture.
Earlier this week, PBS NewsHour reported that Afghan people are losing TPS, temporary protected status. That's happening in July. What's known about why this is happening, and how many people in Alaska could be affected by this?
There's not too many Afghans here in Alaska who only have TPS.
Okay.
So most of the Afghans that were resettled here to Alaska came under the humanitarian parole program on that Operation Allies Welcome. There were a number of Afghans who have then followed that initial wave of individuals who came, who have maybe come into the country in a different fashion, or were here, maybe they were in universities or studying, and have now used TPS as an ability to stay. And so, I don't think the numbers are huge here in Alaska, but certainly what is concerning is the argument made by the Department of Homeland Security of why people don't need TPS is that it's not unsafe in Afghanistan any longer, and that they're welcome to return home, and that, and so that argument certainly has like an element of it that we are concerned about when you think about all the other people who are Afghans right now who we're supporting, who are in fact, applying for asylum and who are going to make those claims that it's unsafe for them to return home. So that message that's in there, while it may not affect an Alaskan right now, that message there is something that is definitely concerning when we think about the other Afghans here who are still working to adjust their statuses to an ability to stay long term.
Cindy, the president has said he'd like to suspend habeas corpus for some folks that are trying to come into the country. Remind people what that is and what that could potentially mean if it were to go forward.
Right. So habeas corpus is another right that is inscribed in our Constitution and our founding documents, and it's really fundamental to who we are as Americans. It literally means we have the body. It is a right that allows an individual who has been detained to challenge their detention, to review the evidence that's being used against them to support their detention, and to challenge that before a judge. It's really an important and very critical piece of our legal framework to protect against an overpowered administrative executive branch. and it's only been suspended in 3 other occasions in our history. It's a very limited, it's very, very sacred, I would say. I can't stress that enough. Habeas has only been utilized during the Civil War, briefly in Hawaii during World War II, and then in 1905 in the Philippines when it was considered part of the United States. And only Congress can choose to suspend habeas corpus, and it's really only in those critical times of insurrection or war. And so this idea that the current quote-unquote invasion that's happening would be legally sufficient to suspend habeas is just completely off the radar.
And in our final 30 seconds here, what do you want folks who are concerned to do? What should they do?
There's nothing more American than speaking out and participating in your democracy. So no matter how Alaskans feel about this, they should let their elected representatives know, and they should also let their neighbors know. So if you have a neighbor here in your community who is a refugee, who's an immigrant, and you're happy they're here, they wouldn't mind hearing that at this point, I think.
Thank you. Cindy, anything to add?
Yeah, and just knowing your rights and your responsibilities, what you can do to help your neighbors, what your neighbors can do to assert their rights themselves, and just, you know, utilizing all of the beautiful pieces of our American democracy that help to protect people.
All right, thank you both so much for being here this evening. Most of us are immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Only people indigenous to North America can claim original status. In past generations, immigrants were welcomed here to take on the intense work of building American infrastructure. And although Trump administration mandates have brought many immigrant programs to a halt, it doesn't change the needs our country and state still have for workers and students from foreign countries to help us solve problems, build the economy of tomorrow, and thrive into the future. That's it for this edition of Alaska Insight. Visit our website, alaskapublic.org, for breaking news and reports from our partner stations across the state. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Lori Townsend. Good night.